Wonderful. Welcome everyone to our Gamecity Impulse online event. What is Gamecity Impulse? It is an online event series that we started during COVID times to discuss topics surrounding diversity, inclusion, accessibility, everything that's related to fields of game development, the games industry, and gaming culture to just start the discussion, start a discourse. And this event is part of our series. And I want to thank everyone that joined us and that wants to be here. Thanks so much for the cooperation. We have a cooperation for this event with the Hamburg Memorials and Learning Centers Foundation in memory of victims of Nazi crimes. It's a long title, it's very German, but they made it possible for us to discuss tonight. And through what they do, they preserve, they expand, they impart knowledge about the Nazi era, and it's part of history. And this is what we want to talk about tonight. We are now in the welcoming area, and next I will show you who is on the panel. And we'll talk about for just 1 hour about everything related on history, democracy, games, game development. Well, it's a broad field. We will narrow it down a bit. And then I will stop the recording and we can talk in a Q&A round in our circle of people that have found their way here. And at 7:30, we have to end the event. So what do we want to talk about tonight? We talk about democracy, history, and game development. So what do we have on the panel? We have an historian, digital mediation and research, and game development. Markus is a historian and he was a project manager for the series game Remember the Children of Brunhuser Damm. He will tell us about this a little bit later. Dr. Tabea Wittmann, she's in management digital mediation at the Zeppelin Museum Friedrichshafen. It's a long title, but she's worked on a lot of things surrounding remembrance and memory and history and game development. So you will hear from her in a few seconds. And we have Jörg Friedrich. He's game director at Paint Bucket Games. You may know through The Darkest of Times, The Darkest Files. And together with Markus, he worked on the Children of Brunhuser Damm, the Remembrance game. And my colleague Senta is in this call on the chat. So if you have any questions, you can ask via chat and we will get to this later or in the Q&A round. So this is the part where I can now get over to our lovely panelists. Sorry, I'm just stopping my things. So now we are here. So now we want to talk to Markus. Please, can you introduce yourself and tell us who you are and what you do? And I have some follow-up questions later.
Sure. First of all, thanks so much for this panel here, and thanks for letting me also co-host later. And yeah, as you already said, I'm Markus. I'm a historian. I work on the intersection between games and history, specifically focusing on how games, through their mechanics, can tell history, make history experienceable. And that's how I also became project manager in, as you mentioned, Remember the Children of Brunhuser Damm. And that's also I'm currently still well, looking around to try to get new project off the ground and see what in future we can work more on how we can explore this medium further in that regard. I think I'll keep it brief, otherwise.
Yes, thank you. We will talk about this more later. Yes, I forgot to mention Markus will ask more questions because he is doing this event with me as well. He will be part of the hosting section, so we can have a nice chat. Thank you so much for introducing yourself. And Tabea, maybe you can tell us who you are, what you've done, and yes, please introduce yourself.
I'd love to. Thank you so much for inviting me and letting me be part of the panel tonight. My name is Tabea, and I've been working now for quite a couple of years on the intersection of games and memory studies. So first it was part, or actually it was the subject of my PhD. So I looked at games as memory media, especially connected to concepts of testimony and witnessing. So that's something that I'm still curious about and interested in. Later, I worked as a project manager and project lead at the Foundation for Digital Games Culture. So there we got into a bit more into the practical side of memory culture and also game development. And now, so it's a pleasure for me. Apparently, I like working at the margins. So now I'm working at the Zeppelin Museum as an educator. And we also had an exhibition here, so about games. And so now I'm really more, broadly speaking, interested in how cultural education and games can come together and complement each other fruitfully.
Thank you so much. Very interesting what you're doing. We will talk about this later. And Jörg, maybe you can introduce yourself. Who are you? What do you do? Keep it short, and then I have a question for you three as well.
Yeah, hi, I'm Jörg. I'm making video games. Have been doing this for more than 20 years now, and the studio I founded together with Sebastian Schulz 8 years ago is called Paint Bucket Games, and we are focusing on games with impact. That's the latest term I learned, rather than serious games. So games that usually tackle topics that seem kind of difficult or unusual, historical and political topics most of the time.
Thank you so much. You will hear about this later on. But now I have a first question for all of you before we dive deeper into memory and remembrance culture and impactful games. So maybe Tabea, you can start. When did you first realize that games are a medium to engage with history? When did this click for you? So what's your origin story for this talk? So what was the first time you realized this is it? I'm gonna dive into this.
Ooh, I think I had the privilege and also the scary moment that a young scholar, I think, or someone working in academia can have is when you're looking for a PhD project and you come across something that you perceive as an empty spot. And of course, it wasn't a completely empty spot because when you look at the work, for example, by Eugen Pfister, so there have already been voices and perspectives that brought games and memory cultures together. But first of all, it was the lack of research there that interested me. So before I'd been working on movies and been doing research on this mediated memory, and I came to realize the way we remember is already shaped in quite specific ways. So we have developed codes and narratives and symbols that are out there and that are our way to remember. And still there was this huge medium, this huge complex where I perceived our ideas and our research and our analysis on the subject and on the concrete games that are out there is still lacking. And I find that curious, and that's why I wanted to dive into it. And like I said before, maybe I can go a little bit more into detail there. What I still find really important is this idea of what kind of role is applied to us in a game. What are actually the accesses that games offer? What are we allowed to do and what aren't we allowed to do? Because I think it resonates with what is driving memory cultures in general. And that's why I think this is the most interesting and vibrant place we can be at the moment and we can look at.
Thank you so much. Markus, what was your take? Because you've come from the true historian side of things. So what was your view on getting into games?
It's a bit interesting because I've always been gaming, I guess, as a from childhood on, due to my father was also still is into games, and I've also been interested in historical games and also always been interested in history. But funny enough, during my studies, also because it wasn't really, as I think Tabea hinted at, it was always something of a sort of niche in research. So it was never something I came across. And then it was fairly late after my master's actually that it sort of clicked, and I realized, okay, actually I can do something that brings this interest together, academia and my interest in games and game development, which have also been somewhat interested in the actual application of how you develop a game, how you program and so on. And so yeah, while I had this fairly separate interest, it was, as I said, after my master's that it sort of came together, and then I was lucky enough to get into the project and be able to apply these sort of interests and figure out how this actually can be applied aside from research in a real world project together with Jörg.
Yes, this is the perfect spot to ask Jörg what got him interested in games and games with impact.
Yeah.
Is it a long story?
Yeah, I don't think it's that long. I have been making games for quite a while already, and got kind of a crisis of meaning when in 2016 when I was wondering, okay, when there's new fascism on the rise and autocrats showing up everywhere, and I'm still making games about orcs and aliens and zombies and military, and it didn't feel right, and I felt like I need to do something else with the medium. And then I or actually Sebastian with me kind of decided, let's try to do something different. And that was when we started Through the Darkster Times.
Yeah, thank you so much for the introduction. And maybe, Markus, you can now help us dive deeper into the memory and remembrance and memory culture, because we have the question in what is, can we broaden the definition? What is memory culture? What is remembrance? It's a full word in English. German has a lot of special words for this as well. So what is this, the importance of remembrance?
I think it's easier if rather than coming from this top-down big word, if maybe we can just continue with Jörg, maybe what does remembrance mean to him? Because he already said he is coming from a very personal perspective on this, and it would be interesting to know what does remembrance or memory culture mean to you, and why is it different from just, or is it different from just remembering as this personal verb? And then maybe continue on to Tabea, who can also add her own personal insight.
Yeah, I didn't come from I didn't have this word really when I started. I was more like, I was always interested in history, and I guess like my personal connection to it is basically my father was interested in history. We had a lot of like books at home about history. I was always also interested in the history of my family. Where do they come from? What did happen? And also always then interested, yeah, especially in German history. And then you can't do that without looking at the Nazi era. And then at the same time being interested in games and making games and realizing, somehow this part of history is basically not happening in the medium you're working on. Or when it is happening, it is only told in war games, and it's basically limited to the last bits of World War II. Why is that, and can that be changed? That's kind of like what led me into this whole rabbit hole of meeting with historians and then actually learning what the definition is there, and yeah.
Yeah, so maybe Tabea, you can add to this. What is your way of getting into this memory and remembrance? You already told us about this, but on your experience with games, do you see, like Jörg, is it in the same area?
I think it's quite similar. What I find interesting is that we talk about memory cultures and cultures of remembrance. And for me, this distinction has always been really important, especially when we talk in the context of games. And I think in German, we also have the distinction between Erinnern and Gedenken. And I think that has two different connotations. And I think very often when we're affronted or were affronted by this idea of games serving as memory media, we have this notion of remembrance that stands at the forefront, which is really about how can we respectfully and appropriately remember the victims of the Shoah, and how can we continue this idea of memory work, which is a work of grief, whereas the cultural or the memory cultures more in general are, for me, kind of all these efforts put together to remember, to represent, to learn from the committed crimes. So it's something broader, and I think maybe the form that memory cultures have taken, they are a documentation of our struggle to come up with an appropriate answer of how can we remember. And I think everything that's happening and that has been happening are somehow ideas of what could be an appropriate way, what could be an appropriate manner to do it. And I think that's what makes it interesting, because it's an ongoing negotiation that always comes back to the present from where it began and from where it happened. And so you can somehow document itself or see how throughout different areas, we always try to find new approaches and new ways to come into contact and to find meaning with that past.
So if I understand you correctly, the opposite you're describing is, on one hand, you have this idea of remembrance cultures, so these shrines where history is sort of fixated, and you have a lot, includes terms like respect, and you also, if you want to engage with it, you're also worried about if you're respectful enough, this whole term of würdevoll and the kind of stuff. And while on the other hand, you say in terms of memory culture, we're talking about games as more as tools that help and enable us to remember. I think that applies well to what Jörg said in terms of how he actually came to it and how he realized his medium is a tool. And I think one thing that I'd still be interested in is what's the shift then from Jörg, where you say you have said maybe something very personal, you have some personal interest in telling something, and but at the same time you're using this medium to engage with society. I think that's where's the shift from this is a personal thing, this is how you want to take part in remembering or memory culture, and when does it come this remembrance or memory culture, or are the lines not that hard, not that easy to draw?
For me, they're really hard to draw, and I think that's I'm in a very lucky position that this is the case, because it basically means what I do is something that I believe in, and that is actually a part of me, and that where I express myself by doing it. And yes, I, of course, at the same time, picking up on what you said, I think games can also, like the parts that you described for these shrines or for this remembrance culture, like being respectful, not being hurtful, trying to, being, I always call it being treating the topic treating the topic right in a way that's that also applies to games, at least for me, right? It's still when we made a game about resistance groups in the Nazi era, it was kind of there were not many role models for these kind of games, and there were still descendants of these resistance fighters or victims, or some were even survivors, and it was important, or with kind of Banu Saddam, the children of Banu Saddam, of course, it's the same thing, right? They're descendants, they are survivors, and you don't want to hurt them by trivializing their story, because it's basically it's based on a true story, and so I think that still applies. But there is no, for me, there is no line, there is no difference. I mean, it's just doing this to interact with society is something I want as a person. It's not just my job, right? It's something that I want to do.
Thank you so much for these insights. This is like a really affecting how we think about games as a medium and what it has as a medium as well. So more effects, there are more parts to gaming and to be part of game development and to experience games. You told us already about this. I have a question that's maybe a bit more into the educational part of this, because we know it's always hard to see it outside of the education contexts when you make games that have history. I'm gonna broaden down a bit from the remembrance and the memory thing to understand. We know that games are not made for kids only, so there are different genres. But why do you think it's important that this is for all kinds of ages and people that want to engage with memory culture and remembrance? Why are games important for this? Markus or Tabea, maybe you have already ideas about this. Why can games do this in such a good way? It's a long question. Yeah,
I think it's a long question, and
Yeah.
for me, difficult was a bit when you said, okay, this might be something that children are also involved in, and
No, I meant that there are. We
Oh,
talk about
games.
games and education and games with history.
Right.
So is the connection is that of course we don't produce games only for children, especially with the remembrance and memory culture. This was my question. Why is it important that we understand this? Yes, sorry, it was a long question.
Well, I hope I got it right, but what resonated with me, or why I think that games are really important memory medium, or a significant one that might help us to gain a new access to memory cultures, is the way memory cultures have been shaped so far. And I think we've gotten used to a quite commodified version of how we tell the past. So I think the way we have not commemorated, but how memory cultures has been shaped. It's not, like I said, it's been heavily mediatized. So we have these big narratives, we have these movies, we have these symbols. So we have certain icons or images that are now ahead that we associate, and they are really immersive, and they are full with feelings, and they can, you have one image and just stands universally for the whole Holocaust. And but I think in this way that we approach the past, the way that we were engaged as recipients of these images, it has been a quite safe position, and it's very often closely connected to telling somebody's biography. And somewhere you have this cathartic moment, and where you are supposed to feel very affected. But in the end, we don't get to question ourselves critically. I think only these moments of when we don't look at the perpetrators that also again have been symbolized because you have reduced them on certain actors. But the important question is what happened, how did the majority participate in these processes of radicalization? What did the majority benefit? And to look at the systems and how certain decisions have certain causes. So it's a more systemic view, I think, and a different way of questioning yourself and seeing yourself connected to that past. And these are two elements, I think, that games brought with them, especially, for example, through the darkest of times, that just shows a very different approach to how can we actually deal with this past and our own role in it. And again, this idea of never again that we always have, I read it as a call to action. It's nothing, it's something that we are supposed to carry on. And now I think it's about finding the ways, how can we actually carry it on? What kind of actions does it mean so that it never happens again? And so I think, so looking at systems, at causalities, at moments of decisions, that's something games bring into the discourse.
And maybe to quickly on that more from the side of the medium, I think one thing worth remembering is we all play from childhood on, even if we don't engage with digital games. And at the core of it, games are a way to engage with the world and to learn about the world. This is one of the first interactions with the world is through gaming, is how to playing, is to understand it. And I think this is why it's sort of, we often approach this question from a side of as if this was something that wouldn't fit together. But there's also an argument to be said that playing is one of the most natural ways of engaging with anything. And why shouldn't this apply to the past, to memory, to history? And I think that's, of course, that's something that has to be made carefully, and something that has to be made with consideration. But I remember from the project we made together with Jörg and Paint Bucket, one of the first things he said is, we're going to make a game that's engaging. That's I don't know, fun is a sort of ill translation in English, but that's entertaining in a way, but also tackling a serious topic. And I like the term game with impact. And I think that's why games are, on the other hand, sort of natural fit to what we're interested in, to have an honest and serious and clear engagement with the past, in order to turn the past and engage with it into this act of remembering, and then where what Tabea said, and that it's becoming this sort of your own call to action and your own understanding of why it matters, why it's more than just what's described in museums and institutions and so on.
Yeah.
And
thank you so
maybe
much.
we can segue from this further into game development, because I remember Jörg, you said at this year's Gamescom that games are, like any form of art, are a medium for change. And you said this quite nonchalant and sort of somewhat self-evident. And I feel like, well, if you have if you have to say it on a stage like this, it's clearly not self-evident. So in a way, my question to you, were those fighting words, or maybe to both to you and to Bea and to me in regard, in what way are these words challenging the broader conception of the medium, both in terms of, I don't know if it's still a hot topic, if games are art. I haven't been following this discourse in a while, but also to what regard to understand this game as a medium for change. And I think this is clearly linked to the idea of games having an impact, as you said.
I'm sorry, what's the question exactly?
The question is
Sorry.
the question is am I? No, I'm not quite. In what way is this idea challenging the broader concept of the medium? And what was your
Which
standing on
idea?
this
The idea that games are a
as
medium
art
to
and a medium for change?
Not at all. I'm not thinking much about it. I think it's not really. I think for me it's a given. Basically, it's yeah. I mean, I'm not sure if we want to open up this discussion. It's probably not every. You would probably not call every game art, but I think games can be art, and then they have an impact on us like any art form, and both actually has an impact on us. Making games and consuming them has an impact. And because they have an impact, then they change something, right? They change us, and then yeah, for me that's that's all pretty much. Oh.
Tabea, what do you think? Well, probably when you wrote a lot of topics about this, because we talk about that what has an impact changes us. I think this is a really nice sentence to talk about, because games as a medium, and as a medium that is really so diverse and has so many options for the player to engage, that means they do have an influence, they do have an impact. So should we make this more visible? Should this be more understandable for the public and for people who play games and who make games? Like, yes, this is something that can change the world. Is this what we not do?
I'm not really sure if we have to make people that develop games aware of it. I rather think we have to make culture institutions and museums and places of remembrance aware of that. But I think maybe I'm also wrong, because I'm certainly part of that bubble But I think more and more we become aware of each other's expertise, like what we can bring to the table, and that we have from the very beginning. I think that we lose the notion that games are always connected to fun, but rather that we perceive them, like Jörg and Markus both said, like as a medium. And of course we have books too that are light and easy to read. So we have, I don't know, we have Dostoevsky and we have Fourth Wing. And they both appear as a book. And I think that's the same goes for games. And I think, yeah, and I think that's what we have to get used to. And maybe we still have to do that, I don't know, pioneer work that some people are still not aware of it. But I think that's maybe the strongest selling point at the moment, that games, also developers, have when they want to collaborate with institutions, with those educators that have by now, I think, brought a great expertise of how to approach those topics pedagogically. And I think if you bring those two expertises together, you can probably create something meaningful.
Thank you. This is really a great insight. I had a question following up because you already mentioned it, and for Jörg and Markus as well, because is this always, maybe this is like a controversial question, I don't know. Does these topics that we talk about heavy topics and topics that are really not easy to understand and to digest, do they have to be presented in a more light, I call it light and heavy way because it's easier for me to describe, or is it, like you said, is it okay to see now we have a game that's more deep and more dark, and we have a game that's more light and more easier to connect to, but games with heavy topics don't have to be either way, right? Maybe Jörg, you can tell us about how you approach this, to understand what games can do in these fields. Does a game with a heavy and maybe really controversial topic has to be heavy and dark, or can it be light and fun? And what is your opinion?
Again, I think the word that I was struggling to find before is appropriate. Right. Depends. I know that this question comes later, but like if we talk about the children of Buldenhuser-Damm, for example,
We can
right?
talk about
Then the event the game is based on is so cruel and so dark and so horrible, that then saying like, okay, we make a game for 13-year-olds, for them, that one of the hardest choices is basically, so how much of the actual event do you even show in the game, and is it even necessary? Is it even necessary to tell about the event by showing it, or by going dark, or by going, and that can be a really interesting choice, and but the answer is different depending on the game, depending on for who do you make it. Through the Darkest of Times is kind of dark and sad, right? And we dedicatedly picked that and said, like, the mood of the game should be sad, and it should show the desperation of the people that go into resistance, that resist this regime, that see that every day everything gets worse and worse and worse, and they have no power and whatsoever, and they still need to continue to go on. And this is sad, and this is dark, and this is something that we wanted to show. At the same time, it was important to show some hope that there is something that drives these people. Why are they doing it, and what keeps them doing it, what keeps them believing in each other and keeping it up. But yeah, it's a different answer to, I think, different games, and it always needs to be asked again. So far in our games, we have tried to, we were never very explicit. Like, we never, I don't know, there's a Shoah bit in or an Auschwitz bit in Through the Darkest of Times that is dedicatedly very abstract, that works with very abstract images and a person telling you. So you're not going there as a player, like your character isn't there themselves, but they are just listening to it from someone else. And I think that because we didn't want to not mention, we thought we must mention it. We cannot leave it out like these war games and these strategy games where you invade Poland and then nothing else happens. But at the same time, we said we want to keep some distance somehow. And that, for example, was our answer there.
You mentioned children, remember Children of Bullenhuser Damm. Maybe, Markus, you could quickly explain what the game is about and what your challenges were, because you both worked on it. And we know the game, but probably a lot of people don't know the game yet. And now it's a chance to know the game. Maybe you could just briefly.
The game was made to, it's a sort of well, let's call it experiment or prototype to explore how can we make a game about the commemoration site Bullenhuser Damm in Hamburg, to engage with young people, mostly school classes, not so much to essentially tell the story about what happened there again, which, as Jörg already alluded to, there were several children there were murdered shortly for the end of the war by the SS, but rather to a game that explores what does it mean to remember. And I think something we discovered in the making of this game is that it's very difficult to make games that are very much focused on the Holocaust itself and these events, because then you have immediately this conflict between interactivity and these events that you I'm not saying you can't express them in game form well, but it's something you're immediately hesitant, especially if you're engaging with a younger audience. But rather, what we did, and I think what the Darkest Files, Jörg's newest game, and other good games in this context do, is they are games about someone else engaging with the past. And in our games, it's a group of young pupils engaging with what happened at Bullenhuser Damm, their school in the 70s. The pupils in the 70s, and then they explore the school, what happened there in the Nazi past. And I think that opens that's a good way for games to engage with a younger audience, because they more often more than even our generation has the question, how does this even relate to me? Because this is removed several steps, maybe even by biography, because many of them don't have German grandparents or great-grandparents. So having stories and games explore your interaction with the past is something, and then also being able to tell that the interacting with past is something inherently interactive, because it's how you remember it, how you want to remember it, what you take from it, and so on. I think that's what games can do very well, and I think it's also something why these games with impact work well currently in the niche of indie, because in the indie niche, because from my perspective, it feels like indie games are much more often more personal games, can be more personal games, rather games that need to be made with a big budget and more tailored towards the market.
Could I just add on that? Because I think Markus raised a really, really important question that I find is actually the most relevant, when he said what these games teach us is what does it mean to remember? And that's exactly what I come again with my never again is a call to action, because that's exactly what I mean. Because whenever we use like historical setting and try to imagine ourselves into an historical figure and character and position, we always end up really, really interpreting. That goes for, and I think very quickly you fall into a position that I don't want to say distasteful, but is certainly to a certain degree voyeuristic, and I think inappropriate to a certain degree. Whereas when games can serve as these moments where we get into contact with the past and we can actually perceive, okay, how did this process work? How did I come into contact? What did I do actually? And I think sometimes it is these very profane gestures. Now, I think Jörg's latest game with The Darkest Files shows that quite intensely. It can be working with files and going through documents, following the little traces, So this is just critique of sources. That's very plain, very dull, very historian way to approach the past. But I think these are the things that we have to be aware about and that we have to get better at. This is actually what we can contribute nowadays. And that would be something that actually tackles the past and has a meaningful engagement. And I think these are aspects where games can still also go a lot stronger and could explore more, I think, because I think there are more modes than this detective kind of approach where you look for the clues and look for the traces. But I think it's the first way of really putting this act of remembering, this act of performing cultural memory in the focus.
Yeah, thank you so much for the insights. I'm wondering if we can talk about what are recommendations, Markus and Jörg, on doing these games. It's like a quick tip, because there will be different approaches when you do a game with content that's different from, let's say, a Metroidvania about bubbles. This is my expertise in development now. So what is a good approach to get into developing or to produce a game like this? So what would be like your cautious tip, like one first tip if you want to develop a game or get into these kinds of games? Is there a good tip? Is it or years of approaching?
Yeah, time helps. Time helps. It needs to be tried out a lot. And I mean, yeah, I think the most important tip is to that the game mechanic should match the topic, right? It should go together. You should think about what not only what is the story you want to tell, but what will players do in the game, and how does that connect to what you want to tell and to the theme. I think that's very important, and unfortunately it's something that is very hard to solve in theory and requires usually building something as fast as possible, trying it out, see how it plays, because a game really only proves its concept while being played, not in description or in plan or in design. Yeah.
I think this is the question is hard to answer because as Jörg said at the end, it's what happens with the game is a black box anyway. You don't have any influence on the reception part and players, but rather I think I think Jörg's approach is the best insofar it's something that he or the studio at Paintpocket just really wants to do. It's just simply saying this: we want to do something. Jörg might disagree, but to the extent would say understanding themselves as activists and saying this is the medium we want to be active with and active in. And I think then on the other hand, the only thing is just to don't be afraid of misrepresenting, or don't be afraid of this sort of thing called history of that it's something that should be left to the experts. Because I think if just having a personal and open approach, saying I have a good idea, I have a nice idea for game mechanics, I have a nice idea for interaction, and I want to tell this certain story and this sort of engagement with history through it. I think this is I wouldn't say that's all there is to it, obviously not, because making a game is hard, but I think this is the best first step you can take. And I think maybe that's not the broader question for the other two as well. I think the problem is that there aren't enough experimental areas or spheres where you can actually try out what's okay to say about the Holocaust or for the context of National Socialism with games. How far can you actually step into this whole sphere and apply interactivity? Because that's something that at the same time it's this funny contradiction of there's a lot of stuff we don't want to do, at the same time it's already been done I mean, Wolfenstein famously and arguably not too bad actually had a scene in a concentration camp as a power fantasy, yes, in the context of these old Jewsploitation media. Call of Duty visit concentration camps and so on, and you were interactive to a degree in them. So funny enough, that it's the AAA games that have already done stuff that we right here are still somewhat hesitant about. So maybe that's something some people that need to explore it in context of game jams or more experimental areas to see what can we actually do and what feels right, even if it, or what ends up being right, even intuitively it doesn't seem to.
Yes, so what you are saying as well is my question was, are there more political and historical games than, well, it's like, are there more games now? This is true, but there are games that go there. Is this a good thing, or do you see with your expertise, Markus and Tabea, maybe, is this like a fine line where we have to watch in terms of what we talked about, memory culture and remembering and appropriate approaches? What you mentioned, Tabea, do we have to have war games only being part of this whole process? So what's your opinion? Are there more games that tackle these, or is it more complicated? Probably more complicated.
Definitely more complicated. Starting with, in my point of view, all media and thus all games are political. Because even if they don't treat an explicitly specific historical or political issue, in the way they construct worlds, in the way they imagine societies living together. So since games very often simulate worlds, they always have an idea of how does this world run, what kinds of rules underlay it. And this all comes with a political meaning. It all comes with references. Very often, and that's why I think Wolfenstein was one of the first ones, very often it gets easier or more extreme when you have science fiction or fantasy as the surrounding setting. So to me, I don't want to say even more important than developing and releasing specifically political games. It would rather be to sharpen our perspectives and to sharpen our analyzing tools to these formats, to be able to detect what kind of political message is underlying there, especially when it's implicitly and not explicitly. And I think from there we can start a very fruitful political discourse. I find it really interesting, for example, a couple of years ago, when you had the storm on the Capitol, and it had happened in a game format quite before, and then suddenly you had the discourses arising. Did this game actually produce the idea, or was it just something that happened because that is something that can happen politically? And so now you have these kind of images out there already. And so even if you have a game that's not political per se, I think it carries a political message. But I also believe, especially now in the age of AI, where the existing content is used to shape future images, and where, for example, most of all quantity and probability dictate the algorithm, I think it's more than ever important to have these counter images maybe out there, that you make the margins visible at least, so that you broaden the spectrum, and so that you don't let the stereotypes be the only images out there, when the extremes to be the only images out there, but that you have these different approaches, the different aesthetics, the different stories, the different mechanics that are told, that might not reach the big players, or that might not reach the majority per se, but that are still there and somehow try to hold the balance a bit. Maybe that is utopian, but nevertheless, I think we should keep doing it. Yeah.
Yeah, this was a follow-up question as well, Jörg. Like, we know making games is not only activism, but you have to make money, you have to survive, you have to be able to produce these and to help shape and to say, no, we are doing these kinds of games, and looking at the games market situation, there are many games coming out. There are many games not coming out. Games that may be one of the most inspiring games ever, and next year the studio shuts down. So what's your opinion on still doing these games? You still do these games. So is it important that we still keep on making these games, play these games? Say it's even if it's outside, like Tabea said, it's important that we have these games there, that there is still an approach to change and have an impact, even though maybe I won't get rich with it. I don't know. There are different ways of approaching these questions, but what is your view on, do we need these games and can we survive making these games? And if so, how?
I think we do need these games. I think they need to exist, especially because of what Tabea said about, like, yes, there needs to be, they just need to be there. These pictures need to be there, right? There need to be, these stories need to be told, and they also need to be told through games. If there is no game that tells about the Holocaust, then in this medium, that just doesn't happen. It never happened, right? There might be people who, or there are people who play way more games than they read books or watch movies, and then for them, this part of history might never happened, and they might never play our game as well, so it might still not happen for them. But it's at least there. It could be. And that is why I think it's important that these games exist, that they still get produced. And I would be, I would absolutely appreciate if there was the Schindler's List of games. So if there would be some big AAA company or whoever going and say, like, yes, we make this huge game with a huge budget, and we know we're not going to make much money with it, but it's so important that we want to tell the story. That would be great. And I always hope that maybe by proving the world that these games can be made and these stories can be told in a game in a way that is still somehow engaging and not just teachy, then that maybe someone with enough money gets the idea. Can we survive with it? I don't know. I mean, who knows in the games market right now, or in any market, if they can survive. We are doing quite well actually right now, but that is, I think, because I think we're rather resilient because we were never successful. And we always were very careful about like not putting all our eggs in one basket and having like always trying to find work for hire and contracts. And we are in the very lucky position that the work we do for hire is always great work, like the Children of Bullnusadam, right? That was something that's a pitch that we won, and that is just along the lines of what we want to do. And yeah, so far we survived. So yeah, yay. And that is also to say, when we started making Through the Darkest of Times in 2017, we thought we would never make any money with that game. We were two people. We thought we would make this game in our spare time and doing like other jobs to survive and to pay the rent, and make this game because we wanted to make it, and then maybe we would make it. Maybe it would make its money back. And it sold 150,000 copies to the day. And it still didn't make us rich. It still took several years until it broke even. But hey, that's still much better than we thought. And we are now a company of like, I don't know how I should count, like something between 18 and 20 people from the 2-people studio. So that's okay. We survive.
And I think one thing you mentioned, and that's something that's maybe also, if someone's really interested in this term of making games in this context, grant money, right? Which is actually something that, especially with recently with the I forgot I don't know the name in English, the Initiative für NS Unrecht. So there's like certain new applications open, and there's now an acknowledgement that games, among other mediums, are should be explored more in the context of remembrance culture, of memory culture. So beyond the question of financial viability, there are these projects being started, and there are the institutions looking for people, not many, but it's happening, to work with. And while certain companies like Paintback are established, I think there's also an argument to be made that it always have to have bring in fresh ideas and fresh concepts and new new developers. So that can be always somewhat of an in-between between this, the existence of like a penniless indie developer or trying to break into big triple A's, like maybe exploring these sort of grand projects. But I think the most important thing is what you said, is that what I think what was maybe to underscore. It's important to make a game that you want to make, that's engaging, that's fun, and that through this approaches the topic that you want to talk about. And one thing that I noticed recently, which isn't quite related to remembrance culture democracy, but still, Dispatch recently released. I think recently they said they made their 3-year project money in 3 months, and it's a political game. And inherently, and in the forums, there are discussion threads where people have some sort of like mental tilt because they're saying the game is woke, but it's also good, and they can't really like make heads or tails of it. And this simple thing, the simple conflict of mind, already starts a thinking process. And I think this dispatch somehow magically definitely drove a wedge into what Tabea described as this majority of games, which are in this cloak of being apolitical, are certain political trend. And yeah, so this is also in a way can be looked at. I'm not saying like you can't plan for making a dispatch, but this game is an example of there's a room for this kind of games. And I think there's in the undercurrent of dispatch, many more games like this can exist.
Yeah, this was. Thank you so much for everything you say. I'm learning so much. It's wonderful. I'm looking at the clock, so I want to ask a few more questions about the present, because we talk about history and democracy and dialogue in games. This is the title. And what about the present? We know there are a lot of history is happening right now. Things are changing, and should and can games accompany these conflicts and this history in the making? Is this something, because we know game development takes time, but is this a wise idea to say, no, we should make games that maybe come from a point of conflict, come from history that's happening right now, because it's important, as you said, Tabea and Jörg and Markus, games are political anyway, or is this a zone where we say, don't do it, maybe not do it, it can't be part of this because game development takes too much time or it's taking too long? Is this something we could think about, like games shaping society and remembrance culture and memory in a short span, or do we have to look back 20 years, 40 years, 100 years to make games about these topics? Tabea says no.
No, definitely. For me, I think games certainly should, and I think I'd argue that they already are shaping the present and are commenting on it. I mean, it gets more and more easy to develop games, certainly not bigger projects, but we get more and more used to having these little formats. And I think especially in those short-lived little spheres, maybe even only gamification, just putting this ugly word out there. But I think you have the tools so that it gets easy, at least prototypically or just on a small scale, to express yourself in a playful manner. And I think that's something that's quite human, that we deal with our present and we find a way to engage with it playfully. And I think it's also a coping mechanism most of the time. And even though, or even if it is not happening directly in games, I would say it is, of course, mostly happening in the surrounding cultures. So we have people that connect the gaming experiences with discussions, and they use games as metaphors to talk about political happenings. We have it in comments, in walkthroughs, when we have let's plays. Meme culture very often uses game images to express a political standing or to comment on social events, and not to use an oldie but goldie, but I think still Skyrim, for example, showed us how especially modding communities, by the way, how the communities themselves reshape the games and introduce topics that they find interesting and that drives them and that matter to them just shows this is, I think it's at the moment the most vibrant media sphere where media and politics come together, and where I think people utter political statements and make them either within the game or through games.
Yes. Anybody has some more ideas about this? Because I have a question about what you said. How can we be, like what you said, Jörg, how do we do it appropriately? Because there will be the danger that games will not get it right? That maybe will shape or try to tell a story from a different point of view, maybe not a true point of view, or maybe like, no, this was not what happened. I will make a game about this, and this is what happened. What would be the concerns, and can we be aware of this? Because right now, because game development is so complicated, probably not a lot of people will do this, but in a long-term running, will there be games that don't get it right? And what do we do with it? Probably there are games that already didn't get it right, but yeah, how can we think about these possibility? Broad question. Is there something we can find an answer to?
Try to. Okay. So the question is whether games can tackle the present or shape the present by telling the present. I mean, because otherwise games are shaping the present even if they tell the past, right? I mean, that was the idea of the and I saw of the remembrance culture games we made. We made this game because of nowadays, or first game because of nowadays fascism, and that's why we thought it would be about time to tell once more about past fascism, and that is also how many people perceived it, not just Germany, but specifically in other countries, and specifically in the US, it was seen that way, and I think also our latest game, Darkest Files, where it is about you play a prosecutor who is trying to bring Nazi perpetrators to justice after the war. So in the new Bundesrepublik, it's a lot about the rule of law and what happens if you take the rule of law, and where could that lead to? And that is also, I mean, that applies to the present very much, even if you can't just go, it's the same situation, but like just from the principles, and that again, people see that. But in general, I mean, there are people that the games that cover the present. But there's GTA in the making. I just read today the news that the rumor. It's not the news, but that there will be Pride events, Pride parades in the new GTA. And there you go. And yeah, that is just like the biggest example, I would say. So I think it's already happening.
So there are things changing, things happening. And what is this, what you would like to wish for the future of game development in context of what we talked about? Is there something you say, we need more of this, we need more of that, besides more money for good games? Or maybe what players should feel or do, because this is such a great conversation we have about what it means for us, what it means for players, what it means for society, for democracy and history. But is there something that you specifically wish for in this context? Maybe in game development, or in how we view these games, or how we make these games? It's open for all of you. It's an open question, but maybe Jörg, you can start.
Maybe someone else, because I'm still looking for a positive note.
Yeah, oh no.
I think I would say just, and that's what I also mentioned before, I'd love just to see more experiments and more games being made. And personally, maybe I'm different to Jörg in that regard. I don't consider the question of if it's appropriate, that important, or something that should be front loaded that much, because I feel it's something that if you just engage with the topic honestly and with an open mind, it tends to be appropriate, or it tends to, because it's hard to be inappropriate when you're actually considering what you're talking about. It's hard not to be. Yeah, I think you get my idea. And I think I'd rather see more games that fail in good faith rather than just games not being made because people are too afraid of they might say something wrong or they might hit the wrong notes. And I think, of course, failing in terms of this industry is a tricky topic because it's tied to financial success. That's why I'm, again, interested in game jams and kind of stuff, or just this more like wild niche indie stuff that's happening on itch.io, for example. But I think just that people understand that this topic of the Holocaust or remembrance culture, or even other things that happen right now, and that people might feel are it feels sort of wrong to talk about with a game, that people would just try and see if it works and see what sticks. I think that's something that's what I feel is would be a good first step, or something that would be nice if it happening in a wider context.
I think I'd have to take maybe a bit more of a critical stance, but then of course they also come from a different perspective. And I think for me, it would be really important, so I go very well with Markus to say we need more experiments, but what I would like to see is more games acknowledging this phrase, maybe, or this impetus. History is written from the perspective of the present. And I take the critical stance not only concerning games, but memory cultures in general. Like I said, I think we've created we functionalized this past a lot. I think a lot of memory culture is a means of making us feel good in a way that we are the ones that remember. So we carry it on, never again. And then feels like, okay, check that list and check that box, and now we're better people. And when we look at the early approaches, especially surrounding Holocaust testimony, you see the struggle of finding an expression. So, and we have this idea this past is something that is fragmented, that can only be traced, that is fluid, that is so beyond grasping it, that we are struggling to grasp it in any way. But by now we have found, and I think, quite functionalized, quite proper, quite heavily framed formats. So we always tell these complete stories. There's nothing fragmented about it. And I think at least to acknowledge this instrumentalization more, to be aware of it and to reflect it, and then maybe playfully introduce it into the stories that we tell. I think that would be the most honest approach. So maybe a bit like Stanley Parable, where the game is always making you aware of you're playing a game. I think that, again, doesn't only apply to games, but I think that would be, for me, a more honest and really important step in memory cultures to becoming aware of how we use the past.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I like that. Yeah, I'm coming from a political perspective, I guess. I think what worries me right now is that games, like most of our digital life, to be honest, is happening right now on US platforms that are regulated by US laws. So whatever develops there might and will affect what's happening there right now. So whether a game is successful or not, whether a game is seen by millions or by no one, depends a lot on how the game does on Steam. Like what the algorithm does with it, whether it shows it or not, and so on. And that is something that is outside of our control right now, and depending on what's happened there and what might be called inappropriate for the future and happening and maybe might become part of the Steam community rules. You never know. Like, I mean, let's say it, right? Like the Antifa is called a terrorist organization now in the US, and what happens to I just assume that Steam has in its community rules something about not advertising or celebrating terrorist organizations. So what about games that have an open anti-fascist stance? And that is something that is really worrying me right now. I think we're just at the beginning of what is happening there. And I think we as in we here, all in Europe, need to get our shit together and create alternative platforms that somehow can exist next to Steam. I know that this is like, there are some and they're still really tiny, but I think that's really something to, it again requires people with money, but I think it's really important that this happens. And also if HIO is an example, but HIO the same rules apply to HIO, right? There was this whole thing about games with adult content recently, right? That were pulled off both itch.io and Steam, and I think this might happen to other topics that suddenly are inappropriate in this territory, and that is something, we need to be aware of, and we need to make sure that there are other places where this kind of culture can happen in the future.
Thank you. Oh, you all gave us so many wonderful insights. I have to cut it a bit short there. We could talk about it for hours, but I want to see if we can have more questions now from the audience. So thank you very much for being part of this. I will now stop the recording and then we talk a bit more. So thank you. Bye-bye. This is for View on Demand. Bye-bye. Thank you.